For some people, I think it's also been part of romanticizing the past as well. And so how we kind of break it down today too and understand the holiday, we really have to work through all of these different components and how it's changed over time. But you see essentially two cultures coming together who are building on thousands of years of actual gratitude and reciprocity and are in this same place at the same time for about 3 days, hanging out, feasting, and tending to other things and learning.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Ask the Expert, the Real Thanksgiving Story event. Today, we will be traveling back in time to learn more about the fact versus fiction, about the truth behind what really happened the first Thanksgiving harvest back in 1621. I'm Yeti Bay Evans, creative producer of Molly of Denali, and I will be your host for today's educational conversation. Thanks to everyone that has joined us today, including our Champion Circle and Beacon Circle members. We appreciate your continued generous support. I would also like to thank our partner for this event, Plimoth Patuxet. We have wonderful talent today that has joined us from the museum to talk about the real Thanksgiving. Plimoth Patuxet will also be hanging out in the Q&A. Before we travel back to the first Thanksgiving, I want to acknowledge the land that GBH rests on. I'm not in GBH today, but I do represent GBH. So I would like to share GBH's land acknowledgement and commitment to action statement. GBH honors the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc peoples, whose ancestral lands provide the foundation for GBH's Massachusetts studios, bureaus, and transmitter. We honor the cultures, contributions, and connections of Native Indigenous peoples to our work, our local community, our Commonwealth, and our nation. Further, we recognize the importance of moving beyond land acknowledgement toward action. We commit to learning from, including, and elevating Native Indigenous peoples' perspectives, voices, and languages locally and nationally through our public media mission. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our talent for this afternoon, tuning in from Plimoth Patuxet Museum, Brad Musquantamôsq Lopes and Tom Begley. Brad Musquantamôsq Lopes is the director of the Wampanoag and Indigenous Interpretation and Training at Plimoth Patuxet Museums, located in the homelands of his people, the Wampanoag Nation. He is a proud citizen of the Aquinnah Wampanoag community. Brad oversees the Wampanoag and Indigenous Training Program and the implementation of interpretive content and techniques surrounding the understanding of Indigenous people, both in the past and today. Tom Begley is the Deputy Director of Collections, Research, and Public Engagement at Plimoth Patuxet Museums. And Brad and Tom would like to share a few words before we get started. Welcome, you guys.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us. We just wanted to share a land and water commitment from Plimoth Patuxet Museums and ourselves this morning. And so to start, Wuni Kasakwami, Nutesues Brad Musquantamôsq Lopes, Wana Nawampanon, Notomes Aquinnah Nape, Nutesues Director of Wampanoag and Indigenous Interpretation and Training, Kuikwasinamu. Good day, everyone. My name is Brad Musquantamôsq Lopes, and I'm Wampanoag. I come from Aquinnah and Martha's Vineyard, and I am the Director of Wampanoag and Indigenous Interpretation and Training. The sun is shining on you all today. The land and waterways in which we gather today is the homeland of my people, the Wampanoag people, the historic Patuxet community, and a long line of our ancestors. Since time immemorial, we have anchored ourselves to our mother, her lands, and waterways, and remain strong and intertwined with her lessons and all of our relations around us.
Not far from where we're sitting right now is the Herring Pond Wampanoag community, who have carried on Wampanoag traditions into today and stand as a reminder, alongside Aquinnah and Mashpee, of their kinship ties and the love that has carried them for generations. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the story this land has seen and perseverance of the indigenous nations and people in the face of genocide and the ongoing process of colonization. Like the water, though, they continue to flow. We ask listeners to commit to healing the land, building shared community and respect with indigenous nations, and to carrying the story this land and waterways have seen. To tell this story, we also ask folks to commit to tribal sovereignty, agency, and self-determination. Without indigenous voices, history remains incomplete.
Katabatanamu. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for that and calling us to action and committing everyone to helping to heal our land. I appreciate that as well. Thank you. So we're here to ask you guys about the first Thanksgiving, which is a complex story, and it's often been told from one perspective, the Anglo perspective. Can you tell us how the story has changed over the years?
Yeah, we're really excited to talk about the Thanksgiving story with everybody today, because it's what I think excites us, and what we do here at the museum is that we get to spend time unpacking that complex, long-running story. So the quick sort of history of how the holiday sort of developed and why we talk about it today is it's based around an event that takes place in the fall of 1621. It's when the English colonists at Plymouth, who we know as the Pilgrims, the Aquinnah Wampanoag, and other Native people in the region gathered to come together over this harvest feast, the harvest time of the year. And over time, we'll flashing forward a couple hundred years, when the American nation, the United States of America, is being founded. People of looking back at history connect that moment to a tradition that was kind of here happening in New England, particularly. And it sort of starts, rejuvenates, makes it national, spreads it across out of the region, this idea of a fall time holiday. And so it's there where we sort of see the origins of what's become now a national holiday here. But then it's also been used and flexed over time to help tell the story for different purposes, whichever side of the spectrum people will come at that with. It was used to introduce new immigrants to the American story. It was used to convey some sort of values to a new citizenry in the early republic. And it was also simply used by families to continue that tradition of taking a break, pausing, and reflecting on what's happened over the course of a year.
Yeah. For some people, I think it's also been part of romanticizing the past as well. And so how we kind of break it down today too and understand the holiday, we really have to work through all of these different components and how it's changed over time. But you see essentially two cultures coming together who are building on thousands of years of actual gratitude and reciprocity, and are in this same place at the same time for about 3 days, hanging out, feasting, and tending to other things and learning.
Thank you guys for sharing that. I understand that we have quite a few children watching with us today. And as an educator and mother, I am also curious as what's the most important thing that we can do? What can we share most importantly with our children as we're sharing the truth about Thanksgiving?
No, absolutely. I'm somebody who went to school to be a school teacher. And it's something that's very passionate for me, something that motivates me as an educator. And I think a lot of it comes down to including more and more Indigenous voices. Here at the museum, we try to carry books and literature that meets those kind of grade levels and those age levels, those learning levels for students that are from those nations, that are from those communities. So I like talking about books that are written by Wampanoag authors, Wabanaki authors, Nipmuc authors, other folks that are all around us that are writing some great literature, whether it is something like Chris Newell's If You Lived in Plymouth During Thanksgiving, Chris Newell is somebody who I look up to a lot. And he's a Passamaquoddy writer who worked very closely with elders in my community and elsewhere. So this is one potential resource if you are unable to bring a Native person or Native voice right into your classroom or into your community space, wherever it is that you might be learning.
That's such a great resource. And I think it's really important as well to have resources, not only about Thanksgiving, but if it's about Indigenous people, it should be written or, produced or created by Indigenous people to really share that authenticity and truth about our own experiences. Brad, my understanding is that you don't necessarily celebrate Thanksgiving, but you recognize it as a national day of mourning. And I'm wondering if you could share with our audiences a little bit about that decision.
Absolutely. So for some people, the day that many people might be celebrating Thanksgiving on, some folks celebrate or recognize, I shouldn't say celebrate, recognize a national day of mourning. It's a day for us to hold space and ceremony for all the people that we've lost, the land we've lost, and the history that has led us up to this moment. Part of why I actually recognize that day and choose to celebrate a harvest feast at a different time is largely because of Frank Wamsuta James, who was Aquinnah Wampanoag and from my community. And Frank was invited to give in a speech at the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth. And unfortunately, he was not allowed to give this speech because it was considered too controversial in a lot of ways. And all Frank was doing was providing his perspective as a Wampanoag man. He literally starts off his whole thing saying that. And for me, I think it's a speech that everyone needs to read. When I was teaching in classrooms, sometimes I would use it actually next to Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, because it's happening at the roughly, give or take that civil rights time period, the 60s and 70s. And so for many of us, it's a day for us to actually separate ourselves from kind of what's going on elsewhere, just so we can engage in ceremony and remember all of those that we have lost. And also kind of think forward for the future. How do we move forward? How do we move on? How do we come together as different communities and cultures in our society to really live nicely together?
That's beautiful. You said something, you mentioned ceremony twice. And I know that there are a lot of people that are reclaiming ceremony in their own lives. And I'm curious, and I'm sure some of our members of our audience are curious as to if you could share possibly what that ceremony or parts of it might look like for you, and help our audiences if they would like to recognize this day as a national day of mourning, what they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. There's only so much, and I'm sure you know this too, that I can share about ceremony too publicly. However, it's a time for us to engage in just very much so kind of remembrance ceremonies. Ceremonies about remembering those that have passed, our elders, but it's also a time period to engage in any sort of kind of like a cleansing of sorts too for yourself. And so there are several practices that kind of fall into that category. And many people that are in my age range, I'm 31, many of us have kind of begun this process of moving away from some of the assimilated colonial behaviors some of our elders have kind of grew up with. And they have lived a life that has allowed us to do this in a lot of ways. And now we are continuing this process. And I think it's a great way for families to even start to consider creating a tradition of their own if they don't want to continue those practices for their family. And like an elder of mine said, I have no problem with people celebrating or recognizing a good harvest feast, because that's exactly what anybody anywhere in the world would be doing that time of year.
That's right. Yeah, I think one of the important components of our lives today is to remain grateful in all things that are provided for us, and to remember also where those, foods come from the land that's providing for us, the water that's providing for us, and that it all is life-giving. And being mindful and aware and having those conversations with our children, I think, are really important as we continue to commit to healing the land, as you mentioned in the beginning. We have a couple questions that have popped up in our Q&A, and one of them is from Faye Kokinos, and she asks, Abraham Lincoln established the national holiday of Thanksgiving as a way to give thanks in August, but then it was moved to November. When did this holiday merge with the event that happened among the Pilgrims in Wampanoag?
That's a great question. I like to start a little bit before Abraham Lincoln. He gets a lot of the credit for making the national holiday because he was president. But we, like the museum, talk particularly about two other people who have a big hand in sort of connecting the Pilgrims to sort of what becomes the American tradition. One man's name was Alexander Young. He was a New England historian. He was looking back at the primary sources that the English colonists had written down, and in 1841 published a compilation of some of those sources, and noticed that source of Edward Winslow's letter that was published in 1622 was the only account of the first Thanksgiving. It's amazing. It's a paragraph that is basically a holiday is based on. Yep. It's a rich paragraph, but it's a really important letter. And Alexander Young reprints that letter, and he says, this is the harvest, or the harvest festival of New England. Yeah. And he references points out that they would have been eating turkey. That moment is important because Alexander Young is connecting what happened in 1621 to a tradition that he grew up with in New England, recognizing that what had sort of been going on here since he was a kid was connecting back to those roots of 1621. The other person who we talk a lot about is Sarah Josepha Hale. She was the editor of Godey's Ladies book, a very popular and influential magazine of its day, and in the early 19th century. And for several decades, she led a letter writing campaign, writing letters to presidents, governors of other states, calling for a fall time day of Thanksgiving, a celebration, a holiday to come together. She was a New Englander as well, so she's pulling in those sort of same traditions Alexander Young is referencing. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln called for 2 days of Thanksgiving. He called for one in August and then a separate one in November. The one in August was following up on the Union victory at Gettysburg. Yep. So it was in the classic sense of a Thanksgiving, which is a religious ceremony, essentially, especially from the English perspective, the European perspective, celebrating, giving thanks to God for victories in battle, good harvest, whatever sort of providence that God has brought. The November one, in 1863, was a bit more of that New England style harvest time, coming together after difficult times to recognize gratitude and give thanks for wherever station you are in your life at that time. So there were two different things that Lincoln calls for. The November one, which again, bringing it back to Sarah Josepha Hale, she had been calling for a day of Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November, and all those years when she was writing. And Lincoln, she wrote a letter to Lincoln, and Lincoln's first proclamation was calling for the last Thursday of November to be set aside as a day of Thanksgiving. So that sets the national pattern. But it's not until 1939 that it gets to be more closer to what we know today. So other than 2 years in that time, a president had to call the holiday, right? Had to say, today will be a day of Thanksgiving. Yep. And but you all probably realize I said the last Thursday of November, and it's on our fourth Thursday of November now. 1939, last Thursday of November was the last day of November. So you had a very short shopping season. Yep. And coming out of the Depression, at the doorstep of World War II, President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, moves it to the fourth Thursday. 2 years later, Congress passes a law, establishing it as a permanent holiday. So since 1941. So Sarah Josepha Hale, was about 50 years or 60 years or so after her death, was her vision actually finally fully realized when it became a permanent holiday. So yes, Lincoln started the tradition and a path nationally, but Sarah Josepha Hale is the person that we like to highlight here as really kind of the leader of the campaign to make it a holiday.
Wow, that's pretty amazing and quite interesting to know that Sarah, a woman, was advocating for this during that time period, and that also some of the decisions were made based around consumerism.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah,
interesting.
very much so.
Another question that we have from our audience is from Susan Wilson, and she's asking, what are the biggest falsehoods frequently shared about Thanksgiving in 1621?
And there's lots of them. There's like I hear new ones every year, I feel like, that seem to come out of nowhere. There's like, I think they fall into one of two categories a lot of times. They either fall into like kind of like almost borderline silly. Like when I hear people be like, oh, Aquinnah brings popcorn to the first Thanksgiving, which is like, okay. But you have your more serious ones too, as well, where people are talking about the mystic events, the events that take place in Pequot homelands, as being kind of the origin that folks like Alexander Young and Sarah Josepha Hale and Lincoln and others are looking to when they actually establish Thanksgiving. And unfortunately, this is due to a historiographical error of attributing a Thanksgiving to William Bradford, when in reality it was actually Josiah, not Josiah, I always say Josiah, John Winthrop. I always mix up my JW, sorry.
Yeah.
My JW guys. And so John Winthrop is actually in charge in Boston. He is a governor in Mass Bay Colony. And so Mass Bay has showed up at this point in the 1630s, and they've already begun to, for lack of a better word, almost bully even Plymouth Colony, let alone the native people. And so Winthrop does call for a Thanksgiving after the events of what happens at Mystic. However, as Tom was saying earlier, it is something that the English do pretty frequently when you study what they actually practice in terms of a Thanksgiving, a religious ceremony, usually for surviving battles, usually for surviving pretty terrible conditions, for example. And so you see folks referencing thanks pretty frequently when you actually read the primary sources, but that's because it's very much a part of like the English religious worldview at this time period.
Yeah, and just to jump off of what Brad was saying there, that's a big one. We get it a lot. It happened 16 years after the first Thanksgiving in 1621, so not the origin of that, but we said, like internet meme culture has a habit of perpetuating things in a more rapid way sometimes, and historians can catch up with. So
yeah.
But the other one also, I think, is like, it's not the 1621 harvest feast is not the first Thanksgiving, and we embrace that and we say yes and no.
Yep.
Yeah, there were definitely prayer ceremonies called by colonists beforehand. The Spanish, the English, the French, they all have their own different ceremonies that happened before 1621.
Yeah.
But in that sort of Christian tradition of calling a religious day of Thanksgiving for, in some cases, making it across the Atlantic Ocean and falling on the beach the day you arrive and go, oof, we made it. Okay. Those were one-off prayer ceremonies that were then forgotten and not made into a tradition.
Yeah.
And then there's this harvest feast from the Plymouth colony, connects in a different way, where it was more in that spirit of, celebrating the harvest, diplomacy between these different groups of people, celebration after extremely difficult periods for both the English and the local Wampanoag people, of having survived a year. All that kind of comes together to be a basis for recreations, feasting, all those sort of kernels of what still sort of serve as the basis for the holiday today.
That is a great segue, actually, into one of our next questions. Since we've been talking about harvest and feasting, how are some ways that we can honor the true story of Thanksgiving in the food that we serve? And Carice Jaffe is asking this.
Thanks, Carice. Yeah. I think, there's what we have here in New England, but there's also what's from your area. So one of the first things we like to sort of say in part is, since indigenous food was such a large part of the menu in 1621, look at the indigenous people of your region and what are some of the indigenous foods local to your region, and maybe incorporate those into your Thanksgiving table. For us here in New England, and what the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims were celebrating in 1621 was particularly the successful corn harvest. That was, obviously an indigenous plant that the Wampanoag taught the English how to grow and cultivate, and it did very well. And so they celebrated that. But the other sort of indigenous crops, and I don't know if
No, I mean, absolutely. I think one of my favorite things for our region, for our people, Wampanoag people, is I always love telling people about how much we love berries and just how awesome it would be to have some sort of berry-based dish, or, squash. The word itself comes from a Wampanoag word, a scuda squash. And so when we're talking about some of these harvest foods, they even get their names from basically the people who have been cultivating them for thousands of years. And so I think it's a great opportunity to learn about some of those foods and learn about the history. Tom's talking about corn. Center that corn, because it is like a tree of life for our people. But it didn't start here. It originates in central Mexico through the ingenuity of native people. And I think that story alone brought to the table is such a great way to teach your kids, and then highlighting your local communities around you, who is around you and what foods are important to them, because food is a surface cultural feature. It's super easy to see. It's kind of easy to interact with, but it's a great way to learn more about the fine details of a culture too, and to build human relationships, which is really the most important thing that you can do if you are non-native and you want to learn more and you want to move forward in a healthy way, is to build these really nice, authentic human relationships.
Yeah. And then also, if you are, since we're talking with a GBH audience, if you are actually from New England, I mean, if it's okay, I might jump into a little bit more what maybe was on the table in 1621. We don't know that much. No. So that one paragraph that I pointed out before from Edward Winslow, we know the corn harvest was successful. So although he didn't say we had lots of corn, we knew the harvest was gathered in. And so corn, that being a real basis on the table. The other food that we actually know about that was there was venison. Usamequin sends men out, and they go and they bring 5 deer back to the colony for the feast. So the other thing, which more general, we know that they went and gathered enough fowl to feed the company for a week. So they went hunting for birds. Edward Winslow did not say exactly. He didn't give us the whole list of what they had that week. But William Bradford, the colony's governor, longtime historian of the colony, he recorded in that period a detailed list of the types of food they had in the area. And we know traditionally, of course, what's in this area, but Governor Bradford noted a number of different animals, and he did include turkeys, which he specifically points out were like a plentiful store of turkeys in the region during that time period of the time of the year. So all these likely appeared. Turkey, guaranteed, was one of those birds that was hunted for that week. Venison, corn. And then sort of the other things that would gather, we always interpret shellfish likely as well.
Potentially lobster
even. And then Brad points out berries. And I think all that sort of the seasonal foods that are available at this time of year. If this fall time harvest is happening, maybe they saw cranberries, and not cranberry sauce, but they're definitely perhaps cranberries around the table. And so there's really interesting. Oh, and Brad mentioned squash, of course, being a great autumn plant and harvest here. One of the things that really fascinates me about the food is the connection.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have a big connection and love for our traditional foods here, and knowing where our foods come from and when is a good time of the year to harvest them. So seasonally, I think that's what comes to mind to me. And not only is the relationship between people built, I feel like when you come to understand what are some of the traditional foods eaten by Indigenous people, but also a relationship with the land and environment, because you become more aware of where your food is coming from, when is the best time of the year to harvest. For example, in Alaska, in June is one of the best times for salmon, and in the fall are berries here. And I've also learned that a lot of these traditional foods are much more healthier for our bodies. And I think creating that awareness and understanding is beneficial for all people.
Yeah.
So
I think
thank you so much. Oh yeah.
To speak on that a little bit, like I think a great way to also like learn and engage with a lot of indigenous communities is to learn about food sovereignty efforts. And because again, taking over control of where our food comes from, and how it is tended to, how it interacts with the land, that reciprocity process, and kind of supporting that for a lot of Native communities right around here.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Reciprocity, and I think that speaks to, again, the relationship, right, that we have with one another, as well as our land and animals and plants. And what are we doing in order to take care and be stewards of our environment? So there's a question from Karen. Is there any correlation between American Thanksgiving and Canadian Thanksgiving? We're in Toronto.
Well, hello from Toronto. So it's a great question, because honestly, we were kind of curious when we started thinking about Thanksgiving too. No, it doesn't seem that there is a connection between American Thanksgiving and Canadian Thanksgiving, beyond the sense that it is yet still another time for people to have gratitude, to come together and reflect on those moments. The origin of the Canadian Thanksgiving, as far as I can understand it, does similarly kind of go to a Thanksgiving ceremony of colonial times. 1600 something. Early 1600s.
Yeah, I think 1600 something.
So before, one of the Europeans coming into the region had one of those religious ceremonies. So, the way we talk about it at the museum is we call it like, big T, little T. There's the big T holiday, capital T, Thanksgiving, the holiday aspect of it. And then there's the little T, which are the Christian traditions and indigenous traditions of giving thanks. It's kind of more broadly known. And so Martin Frobisher's moment was on one of the little T ones that became a big T for Canada, and got wrapped into the Canadian tradition.
I mean, and if you just look at both states, they're both what many academics will call today a settler colonial state. And so they are settled by colonial populations. And oftentimes those colonial populations in the long run tend to have pretty rough relationships with the indigenous populations and kind of in the long run. And so I've always said that, settler colonial states have identity issues in a lot of ways. And so these holidays help you define what is your identity. How do you understand yourself as a nation state?
Interesting. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think coming back to who we define ourselves as based off of what we celebrate and acknowledge is really an important part of who we are as people, and helps us to make our own cultures and traditions and pass those on as we see appropriate for our own families. Lee would like to ask you all or let you know that they would like to hear the story of the actual event from their perspective, not ours.
By there, I'm assuming they mean like the Wampanoag perspective.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think that's something that a lot of people want, right? They want to hear it from just a different voice too, as well, which I think, Chris does a great job of in his book. There's a few other really great resources too, whether by like Kipuna Monk by Danielle Greendeer, which is a great kind of different perspective of she's Mashpee Wampanoag. So that's from my sister community. And Danielle does a great job of telling a Thanksgiving story, a harvest story, quite literally. Kipuna Monk is like saying the harvest, the time of harvest. And so it's a very important time period, historically, contemporarily, and into the future. It will continue to be, it will always be. And it's a great way of bringing in a indigenous kind of understanding, especially a Wampanoag understanding of Thanksgiving traditions, and the story a little bit differently from a different perspective, from the Indigenous perspective. Because for many of us, there's even questions that we have about the actual event that you can only gauge so much information from the very small primary source text. For example, it says that Massasoit, who is Usamiquin, that's his title, shows up. He's with 90 men amongst others. Who are the others?
Right.
There, in my, when we talk about it here, we're often talking about that it's most likely Wampanoag women, possibly Wampanoag children or adolescents. And so there's a lot of unknowns too as well, that I, even as a Wampanoag person, still think a lot about and contemplate a lot about. And it's stuff that we can begin to explore. But I also don't want to accidentally create history too. And so I think that event, just reading those, very short primary source sentences around it and trying to understand it from the perspective of those that show up there, that aren't necessarily living right there, I think is still a good way to engage in a thought experiment yourself. But adding that with sources like Kipunu Monk, like if you lived in Plymouth during Thanksgiving, and a few other really great sources too. Linda Coombs just came out with the colonization and the Wampanoag story. It's more geared towards like middle school, adolescent ages, but she also begins to talk about things from a Wampanoag perspective. She's an Aquinnah Wampanoag elder and tribal council member and historian. And so somebody that's really great to look to. And I like that book a lot because there's built-in discussion questions to have with your kids, with your audience, whoever it might be. And I think it's a really great way to engage folks that might be non-Wampanoag or non-native, period, in the actual event from our perspective.
That's great. And I see that in the chat for our audiences, the book that you've mentioned, Brad, is there available on a link. So if folks are curious about Wampanoag, a Wampanoag resource, there you go. You can check it out there. And I am just so grateful to be able to, know that we have you guys that are here with us today and sharing about the fact that there's not a whole lot written and that we don't want to make up different facts and further perpetuate untruths.
Yep.
And working with Linda Coombs over the years, just sharing with GBH some of her knowledge has been really incredible. And she shared during a fireside chat for all of our staff members and got to work with her on the side and connect with her, just about her knowledge and what she shares for the Wampanoag history and the truth also about Thanksgiving. So we have another interesting question that has come from Sue Wilkins, and she's asking if you guys could speak about the argument or thesis that the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims joined in a mutually beneficial alliance. What did each group get out of that alliance?
Yeah, sir. It's an interesting moment in history. Sometimes when we're talking about it here, I even just talk about the psychology of it, what it might have been like. We usually use the phrase like mutual defense pact because the language of it a lot of the time seems to match similar style military defense-based pacts between communities, between cultures, whatever it might be. However, we do know that this is kind of a document, for lack of a better word, or terms that are worked out between Massasoit, Usamiquin, and the then governor of Plymouth Colony, John Carver, who unfortunately passes away not that long after. And it provides a series of kind of terms and agreements. So if somebody breaks the law, for example, if somebody does something bad or harmful in Plymouth Colony, in the actual settlement itself, then that's going to be dealt with really in Plymouth Colony, and vice versa in a lot of ways in Wampanoag homelands too. And so it's very much a agreement that sometimes I think about Usamiquan must have been thinking a lot about the reciprocity of those terms. Like, what does it mean to really agree to come to the defense of the Pilgrims in Plymouth Colony if they're attacked? Well, that also means, in vice versa, that they will come to the defense of Usamiquan as well if he is attacked. It is then afterwards that Usamiquan is able to use his influence from folks that have consented to his kind of sachemship, his rule, to come to Plymouth and also kind of agree with this mutual defense pact. And we know of at least 9 other sachems or leaders within his sphere that come into Plymouth, to the point where they're actually taxing Plymouth's resources quite a bit, how many people are coming to visit the colony. And so if you were to time travel, you would have likely been seeing Native people, Wampanoag people every day, or if not every other day in that time period. And so it's something that provides a mechanism for these two cultures to begin a relationship in a truly political way, as opposed to just a very social way at first. And so I think it's a very delicately thought out moment. I think that it's one of the, it's really one of the first times we ever see Usamiquan. And so it's kind of a moment where he comes into the scene and starts to take over the story, a lot of what we know. It's tested right away. It's tested, many people would argue, within like months, if not the first year, with events in Nemasket and elsewhere. And it's constantly tested, but it's also revisited. And so that's also part of tradition for Wampanoag communities, is this continual process of revisiting and reciprocity. It's not just like a one-off usually. And so it's always needing to revisit those relationships. And I think even for some of the Pilgrims, they begin to understand that too, because they visit Pokanoket, for example, and which is the primary home and settlement of Usamiquan. And so they go to see him. They spend time there, and they even sleep there. They spend time definitely outside their comfort zone, I would say. And so, but they do it in an effort because I think they realize that there's a reciprocal aspect of this relationship that they have to maintain as well. And then obviously, as soon as the 1630s hit, and we have the settlement of English people into Mass Bay Colony, and folks from Plymouth starting to spread a little bit outside of Plymouth, that's what really begins to test a lot of this, because you're engaging in territories that Usamiquan has no actual authority in too as well. So you're stepping into a place that the mechanism might not be able to address.
Yeah, that was a wonderful summary of the event in the March of 1621. And just to take what Brad said and connect it to Thanksgiving and the Harvest Feast of 1621, Brad was really talking a lot about the relationships there that this agreement was sort of paving the way for in those early years. And after that moment in March of 1621, when Usamiquan and John Carver and English and the Wampanoag have that moment, we see those travels and that diplomacy and those relationship building played out in the English sources. They're talking about going to Pokanoket and this going back and forth, and they're remarking on how they get to know each other. Yeah. And so that fall time gathering in 1621 can be seen also in that context of how it's a moment of those relationships coming together again after months of getting to know each other and living around each other. And so we see that's the multi-layered sort of aspect of that first Thanksgiving being not just the harvest feast, but also a moment of diplomacy, a moment of relationship continuation, and keeping that sort of that trajectory going. And as Brad referenced, it doesn't last forever. It lasts for a while, as long as the most part of Usamiquan and William Bradford are around, and they have that relationship that they had built over the years. But it continues to serve the basis of that beyond the first Thanksgiving.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so allyship is really important. And there's a question that was submitted by one of our attendees prior to coming to our live event today. but they're asking, what can non-Native American allies do these days to help our coexistence in peace?
Absolutely. I think there's lots of things that can be done. When we were giving the land acknowledgement, we were talking about like just supporting tribal sovereignty. And so supporting efforts for, tribal sovereignty, for us to be sovereign nations and for that sovereignty to be protected. There are 573 federally recognized tribes, and there are tons of state recognized groups and unrecognized groups and smaller communities too. So there's a massive amount of indigenous culture sitting right here in what we now call the United States or Canada or Mexico. And so I think it's a great way to be an ally is to learn. Part of being an ally is to also know how to build stages, but not how to fill them. So our communities oftentimes don't have the infrastructure or generational wealth to even better ourselves in a lot of cases. And I think it's about who does have resources, how can they help us build stages? And then it's about knowing when to step off the stage and provide a microphone or a spot for a Native person, for a Native voice, for them to carry it. And that's about agency. And then the long-term building up infrastructure in our communities. Even from a legal basis here in the Commonwealth, you can support legislation that might help Indigenous folks such as myself around education, mascots, things like that. And so you can really learn a whole lot and support a whole lot. But I think it also comes down to building just those authentic relationships, which a lot of times are going to happen through those things that you're doing.
Yeah. And as a non-Native historian, one of the things that I've most enjoyed about like my time working at an organization like this, or the venue that we have here on our living history sites, is the opportunity to listen and is the opportunity to learn, to working with people like Brad and my colleagues, even Linda Coombs and Darius and Melissa and et cetera down the line, all the people I've worked with over the years who have paved the way for the program, and the content that we're sharing with you today, the things that we've learned from them over the years, is one of the great benefits of being a historian working at an organization like this, and the way I've been able to learn and have conversation. And so as my own sort of what I've been able to gain from that moment of, and what you're all doing, you're all attending this event, and that's a part of that too.
Yep. There's a great book. It's called The Gatherings. I forget the main author, but I know that Wayne Newell was involved, Chris Newell's father. And it was about settler and Native communities kind of coming together and holding a lot of series of conversations such as this. And I think it's about having the courage to be vulnerable in these situations and recognize that for many of us, we both need to have these conversations because we both need to learn.
Yeah, that's great. We both need to learn, and these relationships are really important in fostering connection and a society that is inclusive for all people. And one of the things that I really think is important as an Indigenous person is that we create those spaces, and as you said, stages and opportunities for Indigenous people and people of color to have a voice, to share their thoughts and perspectives. And Tom, I really appreciated you sharing about the conversations that you've had and the learning that you have done. And I think that is key, that cross-cultural communication, really listening, being a good listener and asking questions and being curious to learn more, and also then advocate and create opportunity both in our fields of work as well as in the education systems, and really help create this space, because a lot of our institutions and components in our society weren't built with Indigenous people at the core of creation of those institutions. And here we are now living in a time period in which we're having to function within them, but they don't always represent, our values, our ways. And so having these deep conversations together is important so that we can move forward in a good way. Carrie Dickinson. Oh, go ahead.
So
Yes.
you just made me think of a really wonderful thing I heard. A gentleman who works out in a museum on the West Coast and was talking about being an Indigenous person in a museum setting. And a lot of times we recognize that museums can be very colonial like artifacts, right? And a lot of them have their collections through conquest and things like that. But it doesn't mean that museums today and in the future have to be defined that way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that as we learn more about where our artifacts come from and acknowledging those, histories and the traumas, and then doing our best that we can now to foster healing is really important. And I think one of the pieces of healing that we can do is within our education system and sharing the truth and not perpetuating the stereotype about Indigenous people or what happened on Thanksgiving. And Carrie Dickinson is asking, or she shares first, that at their son's elementary school, they're still doing a pageant with Pilgrims and Native Americans. And she hasn't spoken up yet, but she is looking for guidance on how she can approach the issue with the school, also along with the celebration of Columbus Day, and what resources are ideal to share.
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's always really tricky. I see that still happen in schools a lot, and I can understand the discomfort from it. As a Native student, I know directly the experience. There's a lot of psychology and experience that comes from that. But I also recognize that you don't know what you don't know. And oftentimes people don't know that this can be harmful, that this can actually cause psychological harm, identity development problems, all different kinds of things for Native kids, but also set false ideas and perpetuate these things for non-Native kids and even maybe Native kids too. And so I think a lot of it comes from having that conversation with your local school community, maybe even inviting in somebody such as ourselves or somebody such as from our tribal communities to come speak, because our culture is not a costume. It's a program that we, or a talk that we develop here and we have, but it's also something that other Native groups have talked about too. As just not turning cultures, whether they're, there's a lot of cultures all around the world that unfortunately deal with this into costumes. And I think that that's a way to approach it. And also there's so many other things that we can do in that area. And also with regards to Columbus Day, I think there's a lot of research out there that supports just the psychological shift away from something like Columbus Day. Its origins can be similar to some other holidays. For example, just a lot of folks moved into the country that wanted to find pride in their own identity. And unfortunately chose, Christopher Columbus, which, a lot of times today for a lot of us Native folks is like not the best person, right? It's not the person we really want to talk about or think about in any way. And I think for many other folks all around the globe, just even the mention of the name can cause a shrill to kind of go up your spine. And so I think it's about having that knowledge, having these conversations. And there are some really great resources out there. I think of like Zen Education, we have lots of great resources to just, help people move away from things like Columbus Day, or at least begin to educate in a direction that hopefully moves that way as well.
One of the resources that we have internally at the museum is called You Are the Historian, Investigating the First Thanksgiving. And it's a great option for classrooms because it's an interactive game. So it is fun. It's history and it's fun. And kids can explore the events that Brad and I have been talking about today on their time, on their level, and get into depth with through it. As Brad's saying, there's lots of other ways to understand this history. The pageant one is based off of a outdated style, And there's a lot more ways to get engaged and more rich and nuanced and at age appropriate levels.
90% of literature usually, and a lot of the other stuff you see in classrooms is not by Native people. And so I think it's about also involving us in those conversations so that we can do better, because if you don't know, you just can't do better. And so it's about getting the know factor in.
Yeah, exactly. As an educator here, I was part of a lot of those conversations with parents and educators within our school district. And we talked about what would be appropriate here in Alaska,
Yep.
and how can we acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land and show our respect for the Wampanoag people and other Indigenous people and work together. And it often has started with Halloween, actually, and having those conversations that our culture is not a costume, our regalia is not a costume, and it further spread into more conversations about what we can do to honor, our Indigenous people across the nation. Sorry, everybody, but we couldn't get to all of your questions. There are so many today. We really greatly appreciate everybody for joining us. This has been wonderful to learn a lot about the first Thanksgiving harvest during our event today. Huge thank you to both Tom and Brad and the Plimoth Patuxet Museum for being here and sharing so much about the truth about Thanksgiving, the history that you have learned. It's amazing how much you have acquired, and that you're willing to share with us all today and assist us in providing an education on this wonderful afternoon. We hope everybody has a great day and a wonderful weekend, and hope to see you next time.